Subscribe to this podcast to get exclusive access to the after show Shooting the Breeze.
Welcome to Cool Explorations. I'm your host, Tony Peters. Today we will be speaking with author Terry Price of the Boden Trilogy. And he has book one out, and he's planning to put out all three. And he's going to be telling us a little about this series and how God has been working through his writing. Welcome to Cool Explorations. Today we have author Terry Price, and he's going to talk about the Boden Trilogy. And why don't you start off by just telling us a little about yourself and a little bit about what you do right now?
Well, my wife would say that I'm semi-retired because I never stop. But I grew up in Detroit, and so that was my childhood. But at 17, got my parents assigned early to be able to join the military, and that was 1972. And so I joined the Air Force, and I traveled the world for 23 years pretty much. And in the latter 10 years of my career, I was in what we call logistics. And so in logistics, I wasn't always in a action zone, but I was very close to it because I handled FOBs and OBs, which are forward operating base type missions that were going on. And it was really enjoyable because I got to work with the Marines, the Army, and the Navy all together. This is what the military should be like, working hand in hand and helping each other accomplish the mission. And so in 1995, earlier on, right before, it was probably 1988, I had been married, and my wife died of cancer. And that was after about a 14-year marriage, and I was grieving horribly. And I was working my butt off in the military. I mean, to the point where I think I was taking out my grief in my work. I would stay at work sometimes 24 hours in the military. But God had other plans. He brought another godly woman into my life, and I got married in 1991. And so that was amazing. And she's such a wonderful part of who I am, that where God says, I bring you both together to become one. And so it's taken a lot of us, both of us have said, I'm never getting married again. And she had said the same thing because she had come out of an abusive relationship. And she says, I'm not getting married again. So we ended up, here we are. God put us right. And there's so many stories, so many testimonies of how God does things in our lives, but he brought us together to say, nonetheless, he brought us face to face, and we weren't even, with each other. She was in a restaurant she was on a blind date, and the blind date was very obnoxious, very inebriated, drunk, and he was just a mouth. And we leaned, my little brother and I were at the other table, and we leaned back and said, you're welcome to come over here to this table if you want to get away from him. And she got up and left him and came and sat with us. And from that moment on, it was history. We knew that night that we were going to get married a few months later.
That's amazing.
It was God was in it. So she was originally from the Thumb area in Michigan, which is very agricultural. And so when we got married, the first place I took her was Italy for the first assignment in the military. She had never been out of her little Thumb area there in Michigan. And so that was a lot of fun.
Well, Italy's like another thumb because it's the thumb of Europe.
Yes, it is. And so it was a lot of fun because she had two teenage daughters, and I came right into that. And that's one of them is Angie, that I was telling you about earlier before we started the interview. And Alicia actually, she had so much world experience after I retired from the military. She's now a teacher in Dubai. She's been there 6 years in the United Arab Emirates. So we're proud of her. And then from there, I became a teacher after I retired from the military in 95, taught middle school, and parents used to ask me, what prepared you for teaching middle school? I said, the military. I used to go on DC trips with hundreds of middle schoolers, and on a trip, like a 3-day trip. And my voice could carry almost a mile if I had one of my students that got away from me, and they would hear me and they'd get back where they needed to be. But I retired from that in 2015. I mean, this whole everything's connected. God's just leading us through the process. And so I retired in 2015. We spent some time out in Northern California while my wife went to school at Bethel. I became a pastor on call during that time. And back earlier, I mean, before we left Michigan, we had had some horrible things happen within our school district here in Michigan. And one of them was 11 students had committed suicide in a 4-year period.
Mm.
And so God directed my wife and I to start a prayer house in that community. And by the time it was all said and done, after about 10 years, we had 8 churches involved, plus the superintendent of the school. And they were going hard after, saving the kids, to stop the drug use, stop the things like that. And I mean, this is at middle school level that we lost that many students to. But ever since then, and then when we retired and went out to California, there has not been one more suicide or drug overdose in that community. There was an elder came up to us. We were getting ready to leave, sold everything, getting ready to move to California. And we're concerned about leaving the prayer house that we started, 10 years prior. And this elder came up to us and said, "Don't worry about anything. You see that up in the air?" He's pointing, and I can't see anything. He's pointing up in the air. And he says, "There's a water tower up there, and the reservoir is full and will last us a long time based on the prayers and the worship that was released in that community." So that encouraged us, to hear that. And there, like I said, there hadn't been any more suicides after that. Then we experienced Bethel. We back several years ago, there was an author, Tommy Timmy. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote a book, God Chasers. And we read that book years ago, and that got us going after God, because it said basically the bottom line was, wherever you see God moving, go there and bring it back. Go there and bring it back. And so we started with IHOP, International House of Prayer, out in Kansas City. We would go there for conferences and go down there and spend some time in the prayer rooms. And then what caught our eye here in Michigan was Toronto's Catch the Fire. And we would go over there like on a regular basis because it was so close. You get on a train, it's 3 hours over to Toronto from Windsor, and we would have a blast there and gathering what they had and bringing it back. And then after that was the Brownsville revival down in Florida, and we went there and we brought back whatever we could, what God had for us. And so that's been our journey, with God leading us in the process. But so that's been our lives. And now we moved from California to Tennessee. And for the last 2 years prior to this, we lived down there in Tennessee. And here's what my wife said. She said, if someone offers us, this is right outside what we call Gatlinburg Pigeon Forge area, if you're familiar with that at all, a very big tourist area. We bought a cabin down there to turn into a permanent home. But my wife said this as we moved in. She says, if someone stops and knocks at our door and offers us twice what we paid for this house, we're going to take it. 2 years to the day, someone knocked on our door and offered us twice what we paid for the house. And so that was a given. We're going to sell the house. So we sold the house, and we're driving around the back roads of Tennessee saying, well, now that the house is selling, we had to find someplace else to live. And then my wife just asked, just a side note, what do you think about moving back to Michigan? And every other time she's ever asked me that over the years, I said, no, it's too cold in Michigan. I don't want to live in Michigan. Somewhere deep inside, a voice came up and said, sure, let's move back to Michigan. And that was all God ordained. Everything along the way, we had, when we were moving a U-Haul trailer, bringing our stuff up from Tennessee, we had a head-on collision. We were just 15 miles inside of Michigan. Prior to that, we were praying over every exit as we moved into Michigan on Interstate 23. We would pray over that area. We would pray over that area. One of them is called Exit for Samaria. So we were praying out the Samaritan prayer, where that person would be the one witness that will take in 1,000, if not 10,000 people with their testimony, what God has done in their life. But it was like mile marker 15, a tractor trailer pulled out in front of us, and we totaled our truck and the U-Haul. And my wife I mean, we walked away from it basically, but my wife had a concussion. Our little dog got thrown around in the cab of the truck, but not a thing happened to me. The airbags did not even deploy, and
Mhm.
so it was totally totaled. So many things that have happened in our life that God has been in control and watching over us. So we moved back to Michigan. During the Tennessee time is when I finished the work Bowden, and you wouldn't believe that most of Bowden was written in a Starbucks, because I thrive on people, around me. It's a lot of people ask, you can write in that like chaotic area, and hearing all the voices and conversation, the music overhead. I thrive in that because I'm like my father-in-law before he passed. I always said I'm never going to be like him because he talks to everybody. I became him. I talked to everybody. So in that environment, I was able to finish, Bowden, the first book in the trilogy. And even the book itself has a testimony all its own, because it was before we left. It was in 2015, before I retired. It was the spring of 2015. I had a dream. And so it was a Sunday, I was sitting in church, and I had written down these two numbers and the word confluence that was in my dream. And my wife and I were sitting there just talking about before church started, wondering what this really meant, because we really take our dreams to count for some things that we make decisions in our life. But we're sitting there, and I got my notebook out and with the numbers and the word confluence, and one of the elders walks by, and she says, what is that? I said, these are two numbers I had in a dream last night. Well, she said, those are longitude and latitude. I can see it right away. God brought her around because she's familiar with longitude and latitude. That is longitude and latitude. And she says, I don't know what the confluence word means. So take that. This is when I started getting inspired to write the book Bowden, was back then in 2015. That's where it all started. We had written other books too. One of them is called, they're devotionals, 40 Days of Psalm 91. And the other one is just called Just Breathe. And so that's the only writing I've done, but I wanted to get into writing fiction. That was my heart's desire. God puts the desire in our hearts.
Mhm.
So anyway, we have that word and those longitude and latitude. I looked up the longitude and latitude. It's bullseye on a community out in Washington State called Selah. And so Selah became the backdrop for the story, to explain that. But when we were out at Bethel, we decided to go up because I'm starting to write, trying to find my place, how I would write the best, where my creative juices are really flowing. And we found out that Starbucks was the place for me. But to find out some background details, I was very much about the research, making it feel very real, that we went up to Selah, Washington. And remember the word confluence, when you go into Washington State and just before you drive into Selah, Washington, there's a sign that says, welcome to Selah, a confluence of rivers. That was amazing. Goosebumps just go up on my neck every time I share that. And so the story took place, and it involved the Yakima Indians and the Native Americans that are there in the state of Washington. And they were a piece of the story that I started writing out there in California. And so there was this time, all this has fallen into place. It's so amazing what God does. Because Kathy and I said, well, I want to make sure I don't insult their community, their environment and stuff. I want to have the actual details. And so I try to find out who is, you think of Indians or Native Americans, you think there's a chief someplace. I did not know they're, in this area, they're called CEOs. They're incorporated, basically, and they're very strong agricultural base there. And so I wanted to meet the leader of the Yakima Indians, but I didn't have his name. I couldn't figure out how to connect with him. I did some Google searching, could not find the information I needed, but we're watching the news. And just then at the Supreme Court, just after I asked this question, I want to connect with the leader of this group. We're watching this thing going on at the Supreme Court, and guess who was there? The CEO of the Yakima Indians was there at the Supreme Court arguing the case for that he needs more funding to help counter alcoholism and drug use within their region, within their community. And so there he is. I got his name. I found him on Facebook, connected with him, told him what I was doing, and we've been friends ever since. The details, I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything that would harm their image, out there and that type of thing. So he was really on board with it. He said, that sounds great. And I told him a little bit of the story. And so that's all these pieces that God kept bringing together for us, gave us the background. But I didn't finish it completely. And so it came after 4 years of being out in Redding, California. My wife had finished the school out there, and we had been taking some classes together out there at Bethel on life coaching, on counseling, on sozo and things like that. And so into 4 years, we decided, well, it's time to go someplace. Where do you want to go? Not back to Michigan. So we chose Tennessee. And this is where God steps in again to help me finish this book. Remember, I wrote a devotional called Just Breathe. Just Breathe. We bought a house in the Gatlinburg Pigeon Forge area of Tennessee online through a video that we had not even seen the house. And when we got there, we were just there to sign for the house, and all the paperwork goes with title work and mortgages and things like that. We got there, bought our house, and as we're walking into the house, all the cabins down there have names because they're rentals, but we're going to make this our permanent home. On the outside of this home, it says, just breathe. Mm-hmm. And so here's, and people ask us, well, why are you going to Tennessee? And it would be one of these type of answers. It'd be like, oh, just breathe. And so he took us to a cabin for 2 years where all we did was we rested during the pandemic. Both of us got sick twice during that time. We didn't do the vaccines. We didn't want any part of that. And so both of us developed this immunity, against it, really strong. Even so much so that a doctor here in Michigan, he checked my blood. He says, you have so many white cells there. I mean, that's such a strong, he thought I had cancer at first. I said, no, that's just probably the buildup to fight whatever things are coming out of the pandemic and COVID and all that. But he take that to the bank. But anyway, so that was what got us to Tennessee. Then at 2 years, a guy knocked on the door, bought our house, and we ended up having to move someplace. We moved back to Michigan, and right before that is before we moved to Michigan is when Boden came out last year. Right during the pandemic, I had all of these bookstores set up, scheduled for book signings between May 24th and the end of May. And we were going to make a trip going up to Michigan. We were shopping at all the Barnes and Noble. It was all set up, all scheduled. I got cancellation after cancellation after cancellation, especially the big bookstores, because they work off of corporate rules that tell them what they do. And as far as I know, Barnes and Noble still has not come back to live book signings anymore. Mostly it's like this right here, like a podcast. So that sort of hurt, but we still sold over 1,000 copies in the first year, and that's good. That's not what I wanted, but this is just God, and God's speaking to me about the second book, and I'm about almost half finished with that. And I got to have, with everything that happened with the accident, moving into Michigan, and my wife's concussion, and working with her and stuff, and physical therapy and stuff, I sort of like the book became put on the back burner. And so, but it's just, and I kept pushing off the publisher, Trilogy Publishing. They wanted it, the actual book, they wanted it last May. They wanted to do it 1 year to 1 year. And I said, I can't, I'm not even near finished with the second book. And so I got them pushed all the way to October now. I have to have the second book. It's called Come Breath of Eden, which is the second in the story. And it's amazing what's coming together now. But I'm writing. I got my structure back. I mentioned that before earlier. I finally got my structure back, and I'm outside. It's beautiful weather, and I'm sitting at a table around people outside, and the words are just coming. And sometimes I don't even know what I'm writing until I stop and reread what I wrote. That's what God does for me. He just speaks incredible imagination. It's written in the style of C.S. Lewis. When I was a child, we didn't have a lot. We grew up in, my dad was a steel worker, and we a family of seven. It took a lot to put food on the table and things like that. So we were in I don't want to call it poverty. We always had food. We always had something to eat, whether it was bread and butter or brown sugar and bread, something like that would quench our snack time. But as a child, my mom would really influence me to write. She gave me and there'd be sometimes, when you're a kid, you play sick, I don't want to go to school. So mom, what she would do, she would hand me a book and said, okay, if you're sick and in bed, you're going to read this story, and then we're going to talk about it later in the day. These were all the classics that my older siblings had in literature classes in high school and things like that. Here I am, an elementary kid, and I'm reading C.S. Lewis. So that's really what got me, into fiction, and I call it sci-fi fantasy. But what I'm writing now is incredible because it's interlocked with, there's nothing that's in the story, whether it's Boden the first story or what's happening in the second story, that could not happen, that would happen, has been used as a device that God has used in the scriptures, in the Bible. And so time travel, we talk about turning back the day to be able to win that one battle. So God stopped the sun and brought it back about 8 steps so that they could go on and fight and finish the battle. Ezekiel taken up in a whirlwind. These are all images that I use in the scriptures. When I first turned in the book to the publisher, they didn't want to publish it because they're a Christian publisher. And I said, why? And they said it's animistic, where it was giving animals, thought life and things like that. And it really wasn't in there like that. But I said, wait a minute. Well, you have Balaam, whose donkey talked back to him, and I said, and you have all these things, all these animals that were at the nativity when Christ was born. I mean, this is, the things. And then I talked them into it, and they said, okay, we're going to publish it. They wanted me to change a lot of things, and I said, no, this is the way I wrote it, and that's the way it's got to be. I'll find another publisher. And so they accepted it, and they sold quite a few at the very beginning, through their website, but then it hit Barnes and Noble. I was in Walmart's the other day. It's really, really a sad moment, though, when you see it at Walmart, because that's usually where books go after they're discounted, and they're at Walmart.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I get the writing from an early age because that was definitely something I was reading. Louis L'Amour was my author of
Oh
choice
yeah,
growing up. So
Westerns. Yeah,
I owned every single one of his books, and I read them all. I started reading his in grade two, and that was just kind of most of the stories I wrote were kind of that Western style growing up. And then I hit high school, and I started writing a children's mystery, Kids on a Case, the case of the 10 grand kidnapping. And then it was kind of funny because in grade 12, I had creative writing. And for our final project, we had to write something and use it as a final project. And most people just did like poetry compilations or whatever. And I'm like, I've got a book I wrote. You wanna you want that as my final project? It's about halfway done. I can give you the first half of the book for my final project. And my teacher's like was like, yeah, I'd love to read that. So she actually went through it and enjoyed it and gave me some pointers on how to finish it and that kind of
yeah,
stuff. But yeah, I was writing grade two, reading higher than my age level. I didn't wasn't really interested in picture books all that much. I just wanted, and Hardy Boys. I love the Hardy Boy books too. They were the other ones that my dad used to read to us. So they have a lot of meaning to me. My dad's trying to get all the old brownbacks in them.
I would even read my sister's Nancy Drew.
I never read Nancy Drew,
It was
but
almost like Hardy Boys.
yeah, yeah. But the Hardy Boys, yeah, and it's interesting because now even that it's still a connection with my dad,
Yeah.
because he's trying to collect all the old brownback versions, and all the original blue, not the newer ones with the they have the flashlight on them. So he's not interested in those. No, he wants the originals. So it's just really interesting because books do kind of connect, and they do bring families together that way.
We were fortunate that one of my students, I've kept probably about in the time I was a teacher, I had probably 4,500 students come through my classroom, 4,500, and about 700 of them are on my Facebook as friends now. They're adult, they're out there doing adult things, they're married, having kids, and things like that. And one of them, her name is Nella Gallagher, and she had this story she wrote back years ago, a children's story, and now she's like 24 years old, and she had this children's story, but she does not know how to produce it or to publish it. So I had gone through the publishing process, and so her book now, I helped her all the way through. She has MS. It was one of her
Okay.
disabilities that she struggled with and everything like that, and she has been that for years. But she published her first children's book and even got the community involved. They started a cool thing where come down to the fire, because it was a part of a fire truck and things like that were in the story about these kids that were having trouble, with things. And so I got her an illustrator from the Philippines that helped her with the illustrations, created all the storyline, help her with the storyline, and got it published. And so now you can find that on Amazon, so she's so proud of that. She's writing another one, so that's good. So I will love to encourage, no matter what, if they're my students or they're just the person on the street that I run into. It's all about encouraging them, whatever it is that they're struggling with, and helping them overcome that.
Yeah, well, I'm used to drive my teachers nuts because I'd be writing during class, and they'd think I wasn't paying attention, but that was the way I focused. And if they asked me what we were just talking about, I'm like, those notes are right here. I finished with what you were talking about. Now I'm doing what I'm doing, so I can listen and focus on what you're actually saying.
Yeah.
And even in college, when I was in college, that got me through college. And I had a professor who came up and was like, that doesn't look like what I'm talking about. And then I pointed out again, I'm like, well, your notes are right there. You have them all up on the projector. I've got
Right.
them all written here. Now I'm listening and I'm writing. And so she's like, well, as long as you can remember everything. And I'm like, well, I was second highest mark in the whole class in college. So obviously I was listening. And I did get that book published actually when I was in college. Just finishing college is when I got my first book published, and then I published a second one later. That was a sequel to the first one I wrote, and then since then I've done a poetry book, and I've done a book on graffiti, the train graffiti and stuff, with all my own photographs in it. And then I've done a children's book called Colors of Fall that is Spanish and English because my sister-in-law is Guatemalan. So she knows Spanish, so she turned it into Spanish, and I put both languages in the book. And that's all my own photographs are in the book, and my kids are excited because some of their pictures are in the book. So it's kind of cool just to see that, and the kids get so excited about it. Like my dad's got this author. He's doing a book reading at our school. Like,
Yes, I gave we have grandkids now that they're young adults now, and gave them all an autographed copy of their grandpa's book.
yeah, yeah,
But the gist of Bowden, basically, it's sci-fi fantasy, and it starts out with a character called Bodhi. In the scriptures it talks about Enoch, very short piece on Enoch, and Enoch walked with God and he was no more. But it said Enoch had many sons. So I took a little liberty with one of his sons that was never named in the Bible and gave him the name Bowden. And Bowden's actually, the roots of it has, a little bit of Greek flair, but it also has Jewish flares as well, connections. So Bowden became the main character in the story. And from his time, thousands of years ago, he was, I don't want to give too much of the story away, but he's whisked away in a whirlwind. He's taken to the far future into the 1700s in Washington State, the Washington Territory, where the Yakima Indians were. And he was deposited there. And he doesn't know what's going on at this point. And then, so there's this timeline that goes back and forth through the years. And so it takes him back to deal with things in World War II. He was part of setting the prisoners free during the Holocaust, because of his Jewish connection there. And so there's all these cool things. And it's like set up like every other chapter goes, it's like this chapter is Boden, but then eventually he has a grandson, a great, 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 great grandson that was born in the future. And his name is Boden too. He's known as Bodhi. So now we have Bodhi and Boden crossing paths to help one another in time to be able to bring about what God wants to happen. And we call God Eli, Elohim, Eli in the story. And so Eli is the voice in Boden's head, telling him what to do, leading him down this road, down that path. And there was a couple of times he in the story, like most people, walk away from the voice because you're tired and you don't want to do this anymore. And so there was like this time gap where Boden disappeared for a period of time, and he's just hiking the country, until God had need of him again and called him back. And so it's like connected. The imagery is like what C.S. Lewis would worry, like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Some of the things that come out of the war, out of the traumas he experienced, C.S. Lewis, during the war and things like that. They came out in this vivid imagery of what people can see easily with their eyes, just reading the words, that type of thing. And so it gets to the point at the end where it's left off. And at this point, where it was right at the time of the election, the presidential election here. Mm-hmm. So I give a red hat a little bit of notoriety in the story, the red hat, the Make America Great Again, type of thing. And so there was this leave off at the end. And then I told you Starbucks was my writing place. And so in this coffee shop, there was this district manager that I became friends with. Her name was Carrie. So she's actually written into the story at the end as Bodhi sitting in Starbucks trying to figure out what to do next. Carrie gives him advice.
That's kind of cool. And do you tie those characters going forward into the next book, or is it going to be okay?
It's still Boden and Bodhi pushing in, and there's time. There's going to be a time in the story where they're together and they're working with what and things are coming in. It's almost like what's going on in the world right now. You can't make these things up. Mm-hmm. You cannot make these things up. And so I'm pulling on real world events, changing names where appropriate and things like that. So, it doesn't cause anybody any grief and things. But the story is following Come Breath of Eden. It's more in line with what a lot of people, you either in the Bible about tribulation and the rapture, you have people that are pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib. Well, I sort of expand that even more within the word, within the story, and bring that as a setting of what's going on in the world. Not saying that people will always ask me, and this is not in the book, people will always ask me, it says, where do you think we're at, Terry? And I said, what do you mean? I says, well, do you think we're in Revelation or where are we? I don't think we're in the book of, I would always say we're not in the book of Revelation. We are in the book of Acts. We are still doing things to bring in the lost. That is who we are. That's who Acts is really the essence of who Kathy and I are. We want to continue all these testimonies, all these things that God is doing in the world. So it's coming out in the story, a little bit of that tribulation information of where people are stressed and things are going on that just doesn't make sense to them. And the president during this time, the president's name is not, of course, the president we have, but it's President James Brandon. You get that, President Brandon?
No, I don't. Sorry. Probably that's the Canadian name.
That's all right. That's the nickname they've given him.
Okay.
Brandon. So that's who it becomes one of the characters in the story. And there's this time travel event. I'll give you a little piece of the second book. There's this time travel event for Boden where he ends up in the late 1800s and he's been deposited in the Ann Arbor Township area of Michigan. And at that time, there was a relative of the president, the current president, that was there. And so what he did, Eli had him write a letter to the president in the future and deposit it in the family Bible because God knew that family Bible was going to be used for the inauguration. He was going to have his hand on this Bible in the future. And so that's what I worked into the story. And it's a story, a letter that was given to the current president, in the story. I'm talking about the story, fiction, given to the president after his inauguration. He found it in his Bible and he read it and he threw it in the trash can because he thought it was a joke. That's the story. So this is the essence of the turning point for what starts to happen in America and the rest of the world is, we're both you and I experience similar things in the two countries that we live in. And my daughter, Alicia, who lives in Dubai, she has seen some really, really weird stuff over there. During the disinfectant time for pandemic, they had helicopters going around and spraying entire buildings in Dubai with disinfectant. Spraying, and they told everybody you have to stay in, you can't be outside breathing this stuff. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, and our world definitely we've seen some stuff like you say, we can't make the stuff up, and it's just getting worse. What we've seen even in the past week going on with the FBI and Trump. I won't get too much into that.
Yeah,
For fear it
I
might get
understand.
taken down, but yeah, just crazy things that you never thought you would have seen a former president's house get raided. Like, just never would have dreamed of that. That is the stuff of novels.
It is. It really is. And there's this. My wife and I, we love date night, and we do movie, and dinner and things like that. And one of the movies coming, it's not out yet, but the sense of the movie is that it's replaying what's going on in the world right now. That there is no ideal anymore, and everybody's out for what they can get.
Yeah,
Everybody's out for that.
it's all
So
about me.
it's that self-centeredness. That's what I used to work with my kids on a lot. I would use Mother Teresa as a model for them in middle
Yeah.
school.
Yeah. Well, these days, yeah, everything is like everybody's like grown-up children. They're all just children. And it's all about back to that kindergarten mentality is what I call it. And I'm just like, I'm glad my kids are not in that kindergarten mentality. My daughter's 7, so we're still kind of working through a little bit more of that not being so like me centered. But my son is very much about other people and thinks about other people. He's very much into history, so he sees history and he's like, okay, well, this can connect with this. And like my son's very smart. I talk about him all the time because he's got such a high IQ. It's insane. But yeah, it's society has definitely gone to that fiction type thing, and we're just like, I see it and I'm like, the church is falling into that trap. They've been falling into that trap of society and physical things meaning so much to you, your own comfort. And it's like, do you think the Christians of the Bible, were in comfort? No, most of them were in
No,
exile. They were
there.
being hunted.
Yes.
So it's like we as a church have gotten lazy in North America and Europe, especially. China, we don't see that. They're underground and they're active. And Africa, they're very active, even though they're persecuted in a lot of areas. They're very active. And it's like we need to get back to that. And that's what I wrote a song yesterday about revival fire. And I'm like, that is exactly what we need is that revival fire.
It is. I'm actually writing another devotional on the side. It's called Revival Light. Revival Light, and that's I don't know when that's going to be released, but that's where I'm at least every day. I got a little piece of that written and things. Yeah, it's just the word of God, what God has given me as a word recently, after all these things are going on, just we're always asking God, what's going on? That type of thing. And he gave me the word that the church has been asleep.
Yeah.
The church has been asleep and allowed these things to not just infiltrate our world, our country, but also the churches. It has infiltrated. And so now God says, wake up, and when he talks about in scriptures the latter is going to be much better than the former, I'm excited, but it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a lap of luxury blessings pouring out into your pockets and things like that. It's going to take a lot of momentum, a lot of strength, and comes from faith and trusting and moving forward. And there might be some severe hardships involved and things like that. It just yeah. But God is always in control. God knows the end of the story. And so that's
Yeah.
one of the favorite parts that I really see, as I'm writing a book. It's like, well, what's the end of the story? And he's not telling me yet. And so, but I have to have a destination. God, help me with this. Where are we headed with this? And he'll give me a day at a time. He'll give me about maybe 2 chapters, and they'll get written. And I can start to see where the story's headed, but then God will say to me, don't assume that you know where we're headed with the
Yeah.
story.
It's the same with my podcasting. It's been, I want to know exactly where we are. Where
Yeah.
are we going to be at with this? And God's just kind of like, my time, my
Yeah.
time. Like, and it is a faith building exercise, really, in just learning to trust in that. And for me, being a control freak, it's really, really hard uh, to have that mentality, but it's something that God, just he teaches you, and it is through struggle, it is through trial. He teaches you patience.
It's like when I retired out of the military. I was logistics. So like the first job I go after in the civilian sector is airlines. They're similar. They have things they got moving here from point A to point B, whether it's people or cargo or equipment and things like that. And so I went to work for American Airlines right away. And then there was this, it was like 2 weeks after I started working as the debt chief for the Louisville, Kentucky American Airlines. And so, in the midst of that, there was a storm down in Florida, and it caused a 747 to have to be forced to find another alternate runway to come to. So it came all the way up here. It was diverted to Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. We didn't usually get that big of an airline, American airline, in there of 747 size. So we're dealing with hundreds of passengers, and they're coming up to the counter, and I'm working with the agents and trying to just have patience, and you're going to just tell them you're going to help them reroute and get onto their destination and things like that. And I didn't know American Airlines had a person there watching me, observing, because I've just started the job. And so they're observing and evaluating how I do things. And he came to me after it was all said and done. He says, Price, we hired you because you were former military. We thought you were going to be like really tough, strict. And he said, but you're like gentle. And I took that as a compliment. I said, thank you, because it was like, oh my gosh, it was like the second year before I retired, I was doing a training video for the Kentucky Air National Guard for military training for things that happened on the flight line during war. And so in that video, I had my veins were popping out here as I was screaming at 3 of these military guys, and I looked like a monster in this video. And at that moment, I said, God, that's not who I am. Please make me gentle as a lamb. So go fast forward to that moment at American Airlines, and this guy is saying, you're like gentle. I took that as an answer, what God started with me back then. And so I didn't work for American Airlines anymore. We moved back to Michigan. And that's where I went back to school, became a teacher, and got on board with that pretty quick. Got a job right out of after going back to school, and taught for 15 years. So 17 years, because I had a year out in California too.
Yeah,
But
and I have a good friend who actually a couple good friends who are teachers. And yeah, it's they've been kind of leery about some of the stuff that they've been seeing, and even with lack of concern with parents,
yeah,
like parents just don't care. They call them because their kids skipped class, and it's like, why are you telling me? Deal with it.
yeah.
And it's just like, don't you care about what your kids are learning in school, what they're doing in school?
I used to confront teachers. If I'm walking by a classroom and I hear them teaching something that's not in the curriculum, I'd wait till their class was over. Then I'd go in and talk to them. And I say, why are you teaching this? One of the things was this teacher was blaming religion for all the world's woes, blaming religion. I says, is that in your textbook? He says, no. I says, well, why are you teaching that to young moldable minds type of thing? And he didn't have an answer. So I mean, it really it really grates. I mean, when they divert from what they're supposed to be teaching and teaching uh,
Yeah.
their own beliefs and things like that. Yeah.
Well, and it's the same with when they did the puberty stuff at school for my son. We did our own little puberty talk at home, because it's like, I want you to know what's going on. And my son's like, well, I know all this, Dad. And I'm like, yeah, but you need to hear it. And we watch a lot of nature shows. So, I mean, some of the stuff he picks up on from nature shows just from in there, but he knows what's right, and he will actually do his own research on different things. And we always tell him with puberty stuff, come talk to us. If you have any questions, especially come talk to us. Don't go to your teachers or anything necessarily, because what they're teaching you is not necessarily biblical. But it's the same with evolution stuff. He hasn't really come across that too much at school yet, but he's going into grade 6, so pretty soon they'll be starting to really hammer on that. And he already knows, like when we hear on the nature shows millions of years, my son's like, no way. He's like, prove it. He's like, prove it. Like, and I'm like, they can't prove it. It's their
Right.
dating is based on theories,
Right.
science that they have made up, not necessarily science that they've
You're right.
actually been able to prove, because they can't prove it was millions of years old. They weren't there. How do they prove it? Well, they're like, well, carbon. I'm like, well, that's again based on a theoretical formula. So my son
Yeah.
is very interesting how he picks up on all that and is just like correcting them.
When you say things about like what you want to imply when you're a teacher in a school, you want to really influence, no matter, you want to bring in godly principles. I knew all the hiding places where boy and girl at middle school level would go to kiss or whatever it was they were doing. And so
Yeah.
I would find them, and I would say, are you planning on marrying her? And the boy would usually say, no. I said, well, get your hands off someone's future wife. And so they like walk away thinking about that.
Yeah.
That's what they're actually doing. So I used my methods, that really seemed to really go home with them quite a bit.
Yeah, my son hates when there's kissing in movies. He's when my wife and I laugh and we'll joke about it. We're like, "Oh, your favorite part," and because you can tell it's building up and it's gonna come here. It's like, "Oh, they're gonna kiss," and then my son's just like, oh, "Really?" He's like, "Gross," and I'm like, they have to include at least something in every single thing now, unless it's a pure flicks movie or whatever. But even, I mean, there's kissing in some of those ones too. I mean, kissing's not
Yeah.
completely
Yeah.
bad,
One
but
of
in
one
his
of the
mind it is.
one of the electives I would teach was drama and theater. And so I would show a lot of musicals. I mean, the older musicals. And there'd be this moment where something's happening, and the kids would say, they're not going to sing again, are they?
Singing in the rain. Yeah, I grew up on a lot of those things. White Christmas, Singing in the Rain, Holiday Inn. But yeah, like all these classics that now
Yes.
people even my age are like, you watch that? I'm like, I grew up on that stuff. My parents
Uh-huh.
watched it. But yeah, it's really interesting just to see kind of God at work through even those kind of situations where I can see that in my own children. how God's working in my son's mind, and is like formulating him. How throughout your work and your own life can have you seen God at work throughout your journey and your the process as you've gone along?
Uh, his influence has been there even when I walked away from him. I was in my 20s, and at that time, I was raised a very conservative church growing up, and and my mom was a Sunday school teacher. So right there, God was already speaking through her to me. But she would use her kids we would be the test pilot for her Sunday school lessons. And so we'd have to sit down. She'd have the flannel board, up with the little cutouts on them, and show the story of whatever it was she was
I
teaching.
remember those flannel boards.
And so I really received a lot during that. And my little brother, he always says, I must have missed that because he doesn't remember all these things. So right from the get-go, I had a strong handle. I accepted Christ when I was a teenager. The conference was called Uncle Ed, and he was some guy who came in from someplace and had all these youth people there. And that's where I accepted Christ, was baptized in that moment. But then in my 20s, I started dabbling in uh, Native American mysticism, and about there is this creator. Well, I think they're like the same thing. I believe the same thing. They believe that there's a creator out there, and I believe that we have a creator God. And so I just keep getting deeper into it, to a point where they had Kachina dolls here and there and stuff around the house. And then it became a moment when, like I said, my first wife got sick and died of cancer. I started like, God, and you know how he says that he brings good out of everything.
Yeah.
He brought me back around to where I needed to be. And when my wife and I got married, my second wife, that our first duty assignment was in Italy. And we were stationed, I was Air Force, but we were stationed in an Army post, logistics. And our chaplain was Assembly of God. And some of the things he was teaching on blew me away about the fullness of the spiritual gifts of what God has given to man, through his son, Jesus Christ, in that moment. And so we started learning a lot more, and that started making us hungry for more of God. My wife was gaining, I was gaining. And so I just thank God that he was the chaplain there, in Italy. And so from that moment on, when we got out of the service, we found a really good church. We were going gangbusters there. And then, I mean, it's just been a move of God after move of God in our lives. Like I mentioned about our oldest daughter dealing with the brain tumor, and then the brain surgery and seizures, and a lot of things throughout her entire adult life. I mean, they were giving her radiation and they didn't even know she was pregnant. So the baby was born a preemie, and Adelaide is now a college student. She's a junior. And so no effects from the radiation. And God was always in control of our lives. And the more we give him that recognition of who he is in our lives, the more he reveals even more of himself.
Yeah.
It's that going after the mystery of God, wanting to know that intimate relationship, like the bride and bridegroom paradigm that's out there. That's, I mentioned that the church is one of our callings, the bride of Christ. And we really adopted a lot of what Mike Bickle taught at IHOP, International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Developed a lot. I mean, that's where we gained the most, mileage out of the teachings that we were always going after, trying to get this and that, our insight. And that became a part of our DNA. And when we talk about, we're here now in Michigan, and we haven't settled into a permanent place yet. Of course, there's a church, not too far from us that we frequent on a regular basis, but it's the call of the bride, of meeting as many pastors and priests and things like that as possible, to really, I always ask, if we're like in a restaurant And I can see all these people. It was Sunday, people go to the restaurant right after church. Some coming in really dressed, really nice shirt and tie. I'm a blue jeans guy now,
I
but
like my blue jeans. Yeah.
coming in really dressed, and I'll ask them, what did they preach? What did your pastor preach on? And they'll tell me, because I want my ear to the ground. I want to know where there are similarities happening of what God has impressed upon pastors and priests to be able to share with their congregations. And it's given me a lot of insight of what is really going on. There is I would look at one church. Websites are great for this, finding out what their sermon was about, and then finding this other church that maybe is 20, 30 miles away, and they taught on the same idea, and they're different denominations, or they're different non-denominations. And so when God is speaking, he makes it clear to those that will listen. If you have an ear, listen, hear what I am saying to the churches. And so we are picking up on that too. And so there, like I said, that when even writing the book, God's intervention in our lives, taking us, to California to write the majority of the book, and then wrapping it up in Tennessee. I mean, every aspect of the way, when someone asks, why did we come back to Michigan? It's the person in front of us. It's because of you. That's our standard answer. Because of you is why we're back. We just want to encourage you, whatever we can do, to speak into your life. And that's the fun part of it. Worship is a major part of our lives too. My wife's a musician. I have moved this baby grand 5 times in the last 20 years that she has. And I found out how to move a baby grand on YouTube, how to pack it, how to put it on a skateboard, and how to roll it right out of the house, right into the moving truck.
So, what advice would you have for someone who's a Christian and they're looking at getting into writing books?
I would say first, if you don't have a mentor, find a mentor that is writing, is publishing, that is, can answer questions for you to get over the hurdles. And don't lose sight of the target. What is it you want to write about? It? What's your passion? Because God puts the passion in your hearts. These are ideas that he has given us to be able to pour out, no matter if it's fiction or nonfiction, whether it's self-help books or it's devotionals. God is always speaking to his sons and daughters. And then rely on that. And then don't be just a reservoir. You find someone, I know this has to do with writing, but the question is where should you be? You should have someone that is like younger than you, that you're speaking into their lives. And then build on find that mentor or that pastor. One of the fortunate things that happened to us is one of the churches in Michigan, the pastor, he's gone now, he passed away a few years ago, but his name was Brent Miller. He had to be the most humble person I've ever run into. And he was such an encourager and edifier. He came over to our house one day and he says, Terry, I want to do whatever it takes to help gird you up in what it is you feel, what you sense God calling you to. And so he was that kind of man. And so we learned a lot in that process in that particular church. It was called the Father's House. It's now a different church now, another pastor, and they renamed everything. But it was a really sweet time. God takes those moments. It's like when we went to Tennessee. We were in Tennessee for 2 years, and it was a rest period for us because the last 4 years had been pretty intense out in California at Bethel with the things that we had experienced, plus the wildfires. There was 2 different wildfires. That we had one wildfire that was like you could see the flames down at the end of our road, and so all these traumatic things and things we were doing at the church were very consuming. And God knew we needed a rest break. And so going back to people that write, take rest when necessary. Let God just work on you during that time. Let him, the insight when you rest, it's like this. If I can give you a visual, I was speaking to one of our friends. He's a former pastor and he's retired now. And as I was talking to him on the phone, I'm driving my truck down the road. I'm talking to him on the phone. I'm having a vision at the same time. And in this vision, God has me in the pouch of a slingshot and he's got it pulled back like he's getting ready to release it. And I'm like there, I says, and I'm asking God, what does this mean? He says, this is where I've got you right now. And he said, do you know what this pouch is called? I said, no. The pouch is called the rest. The rest is where he had us. And he says, and I'm not going to let you go until you're rested. But God's encouragement in that is he at least has us in a slingshot, and he's going to shoot us out someplace, somewhere, sometime, and it'll be the right time. And it's just not now. And so now we're still in that rest mode. I'm writing again. That actually brings me a lot of relaxation, is to write. We're not really, we're for a period of time, I mean, I know this question was about writing, but it all fits into it. Why I love writing so much. You journal. I tell people constantly, journal on a regular basis. No matter if you've had a boring day, write down something, one thing that God did incredible or did good in your life today. Even if you woke up breathing. My dad always used to say, I ask him, how you doing, Dad? And he'll say, I'm above ground and breathing. And that's his good sign for the day. And so that's that little mantra of sorts really fits me too. It's a good day. Every day is a good day, no matter what happens to us, no matter what goes on. And so, but then commit time to writing, coming back to the writing, commit time to it, structure yourself. I came out of the military very logistical. I was very much, I had to have planes off on time and in their place. And I would have colonels that were pilots, and they would like be worried they weren't going to get off the ground on time and into their mission. I would take them by the elbow. I said, it's going to be okay. And they would just calm right down in that moment. So structure is important for writing, making time. After I left the military, I became a teacher. God caused me to be a different type of person, that whatever happens, and just deal with it. Because with students, constantly, you have to have patience, and everything doesn't get off on time in middle school or high school. So, yeah. And so you take both of those characteristics, and my structure, I build it, but I have to be in a chaotic situation to write. I have to have people moving around me and talking and listening to music that is overhead and things like that. It's just one of those incredible moments. So I guess that for a writer that's just trying to really get it going, find a place where you write well. And there are different environments, atmospheres. It could be that secluded spot in your house that only you and your writing's taking place. It could be where you need to have headphones on and listen to some of the music that really inspires you, motivates you. I do that sometimes because I go online and I look for, if I'm writing sci-fi fantasy, I look for this motivational music, instrumental, that came from a lot of probably different movies and things like that. And I'm listening to that power. And there'll be sometimes like I'll be beating on the table to the drums that are happening, on the music. And I just had headphones and no one else is hearing this other than me. And
Lord of the Rings, they've got a great soundtrack.
There you go. That's one of my favorite scores, screen scores. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for coming on. I've really enjoyed this chat. We'll have to chat again some more. But yeah, we are out of time. So thank you for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed this.
I have too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Cool Explorations. You've just been listening to author Terry Price speak about his Boden Trilogy, in book 1 in particular, the book Boden. And he has been talking about how God has been working through his writing, as well as about what his book's about and the message that it's trying to convey. If you'd like to contact me for any reason, you can do so at tpeters745@gmail.com. Well, I have just been blessed with so many people who are requesting to be on the show, and I'm impressed with how many people want to share their testimonies or what they're doing for the Lord right now. If I haven't got back to you, I promise I will get back to you. I look forward to speaking with each of you and interviewing you, and keep tuning into the show. There's lots of new people that are coming on here, and if you're considering wanting to come on the show, just shoot me an email at tpeters745@gmail.com, and I will get back to you.